Well, I'm noticing some faces from many different time zones today. Welcome, everybody. Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush peoples, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums, moving into the fall season and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. We are delighted and honored to have with us once again the award-winning novelist and activist Elif Shafak. We are celebrating her new novel, The Island of Missing Trees. It's published by our friends at Bloomsbury Books. It is a very rich and very beautifully constructed work of fiction. It follows the relations of two teenagers, one a Greek Cypriot, the other a Turkish Cypriot. It's really telling an amazing story, exploring the complexities that the two live under. I mean, the narrative is really so deeply enmeshed in history and politics, the politics of division, in eco-consciousness, and it really has a sensitivity to the nuances of identity. So we're really very excited about this book on so many different levels. Ms. Shafak is the author of over 20 books, 12 of which are novels. Her work has been translated into many languages. Her novel, 10 Minutes, 38 Seconds, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and the RSL Andaji Prize. Her previous novel, The 40 Rules of Love, was chosen by the BBC among the 100 novels that shaped our world. Ms. Shafak holds a PhD in political science and has taught at various universities in Turkey, the US, and the UK, including St. Anne's College in Oxford, where she is an honorary fellow. She is a member of the We Forum Global Agenda Council on Creative Economy and a founding member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Ms. Shafak is also a well-known advocate for women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and freedom of speech. She contributes to major publications around the world, and she was awarded the Chevalier Medal of Arts and Letters and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. It is really such a great honor to have her with us today. Joining her in conversation will be Ipek Burnett. Ms. Burnett is a Turkish-American novelist and contributing writer at Counterpunch. She serves as the chair on the board of Voices of Witness, a human rights and oral history educational nonprofit based here in San Francisco. Dr. Burnett is also on the executive committee of Human Rights Watch's San Francisco chapter. She is the author of A Jungian Inquiry into the American Psyche, the Violence of Innocence, published by Routledge Books. So it is such an honor and a pleasure to have you both gracing our virtual halls once again. It has been over a year since our last event together, so much has changed in the world. We are grateful we could convene with you in this way. So Elif Shafak, Ipek Burnett, welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, City Lights Books, for organizing this event. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today. And Elif, of course, hoş geldiniz. Welcome back. Just like Peter said, about a year ago, we talked about your previous novel, 10 Minutes, 38 Seconds in the Strange World, which was shortlisted for Booker Prize. Congratulations. And here we are to talk about your brand new novel, The Island of Missing Trees. You are so prolific, it's quite an inspiration. And like Peter was saying, your books are translated into so many languages all around the world. And a lot of times they come with different cover designs. I do want to quickly show the cover design we have here in the United States. It is enchanting. It's such a vibrant, intricate image, the fig tree, all these details weaved in together, right? The fig tree, butterflies, and birds, and here's an evil eye, of course. And I find that richness, vibrancy, it complements the story inside the book so well, because just like the cover, the novel, the story is very rich, multifaceted. First of all, it is beautifully written, very lyrical. And as always, of course, in it, you tackle some of the biggest, most complicated issues, such as memory, remembering, trauma, loss, division, displacement, as well as, of course, resilience and renewal and love. So I have a lot to ask you today, but let's get situated in the story. I would love to begin with place. This story takes place in 1970s Cyprus, as well as modern day London, of course. But let's focus on Cyprus, because not many people know the very complicated history of Cyprus, although so much of it is very, very recent history. Can you tell us a little bit about Cyprus, and also how and why you were drawn to writing about Cyprus?
Thank you so much, Ipek. First of all, thank you for your generous words. I'm very excited that we're having this conversation together. The thing is, I have been wanting to write about Cyprus for a very, very long time. It's been always somehow on my mind. I've been thinking about it, reading about it, taking little notes, doing research, talking to people, visiting the island, but always throughout the years, keeping it to myself, because I could not dare to write about this. Precisely because, as you said, it's a very, very complex and difficult story to tell, in the sense that this is a place that has experienced partition, division. As we're speaking, there's a demarcation line there that's being patrolled by United Nations troops. And Nicosia, in that regard, is the last divided capital in Europe. There is a line that separates Christians from Muslims, literally, and Greek Cypriots from Turkish Cypriots. And perhaps just as important is the fact that there are clashing memories. So depending on whom you talk to, whether north or south, people will tell you a different interpretation or version of history, understandably. And there are lots of wounds that are still unhealed. So in Cyprus, the past is not a bygone affair. It's not like a chapter that has been left behind. I personally think it's very much alive. The past is breathing within this present moment. So there's accumulated hurt, pain, unexpressed grief. And how do you approach, as a novelist, how do you approach such a difficult and sensitive subject without yourself falling into the trap of nationalism, without yourself falling into the trap of tribalism, So I couldn't find a door, I couldn't find an opening into the story until I found the fig tree. And it's going to sound strange, but I feel incredibly grateful to this ficus carica, this fig tree, because it gave me a completely different perspective and maybe a little bit more courage. And only then I was able to start writing this novel.
I do want to mark that. I do want to come back to the tree, because I do want to talk much more about the fig tree. But I agree with you that I think it's so significant that it was a tree that enabled you to go into the story, and the presence of that tree gives the novel a quality, I feel like, groundedness, strength and stability, a sturdiness, and of course that wisdom, right? This very certain natural wisdom that comes. I do want to return to that. But one more thing, I do want to stay with Cyprus and actually invite you to read a little section, because like I said, it's such a lyrical, beautiful novel. I want our audience to be able to hear the language. And so just the beginning, and with that other paragraph that we had talked about earlier, the capital paragraph, if you could please read those to us, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So this book is dedicated to immigrants and exiles everywhere, the uprooted, the rerouted, the rootless, and to the trees we left behind, rooted in our memories. And I'm just going to read the very first page, just a maybe little section. Once upon a memory, at the far end of the Mediterranean Sea, there lay an island so beautiful and blue that the many travelers, pilgrims, crusaders, and merchants who fell in love with it either wanted never to leave or tried to tow it with hemp ropes all the way back to their own countries. Legends, perhaps, but legends are there to tell us what history has forgotten. It has been many years since I fled that place on board a plane, inside a suitcase made of soft black leather, never to return. I have since adopted another land, England, where I have grown and thrived. but not a single day passes that I do not yearn to be back, home, motherland. It must still be there where I left it, rising and sinking with the waves that break and foam upon its rugged coastline, at the crossroads of 3 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Levant, that vast and impenetrable region vanished entirely from the maps of today. The capital in the island was split by a partition which sliced right through it like a slash to the heart. Along the demarcation line, the frontier, were dilapidated houses riddled with bullet holes, empty courtyards scarred with grenade bursts, boarded stores gone to ruin, ornamented gates hanging at angles from broken hinges, luxury cars from another era rusting away under layers of dust. Roads were blocked by coils of barbed wire, piles of sandbags, barrels full of concrete, anti-tank ditches, and watchtowers. Streets ended abruptly here, like unfinished thoughts, unresolved feelings.
Thank you, Elif. Thank you for reading it. And that ending, the unfinished thoughts, unresolved feelings, I think that's very much the task at hand here. That is what you have beautifully undertaken with this novel. You are attending to those unfinished thoughts, unresolved feelings, and you're inviting us, the reader, to do the same, to notice them, to honor them, to at least try to understand them a little better. And what is really remarkable here is, well, we of course know that unresolved feelings, if they're denied, ignored, they don't simply go away. They just go under the surface. They keep breathing and simmering under surface until the right time comes, until there's a chance, then they resurface. In psychology, we say, the repressed always returns. What is remarkable here is you're showing us that it doesn't have to happen in the lifetime of one person. Rather, at times, the unresolved, the repressed, the untold can make its way through to the next generation's hearts and minds. So you're talking about inherited pain. You're talking about intergenerational trauma. Can you expand on that a little bit more? What does it mean to you? What does it look like?
Absolutely. And I know it's, of course, very much, your writing, your research, your work, as you said, what we don't confront, what we don't remember, we can't repair. And I think what we can't repair, we're bound to repeat in some way or another. So memory is a responsibility. Memory helps us to heal. We're not talking about being stuck in the past, but understanding both the beauties and atrocities of the past. We tend to talk about family stories a lot, but less so about family silences. And I think there's so many family silences that somehow shape us. Those silences, those absences or gaps, whatever you call them, the fact that they are not expressed doesn't mean they have no impact on us. They continue to shape our psyche. We don't quite know how or why, but they have an impact on us. So basically what I'm trying to say is I am interested in intergenerational memories and traumas and silences. And what I've been observing over the years is on both sides of the Atlantic, actually, especially with families who have experienced some kind of displacement, immigration, but also any family that comes from a complex background. The first generation are the ones who have gone through lots and lots of hardships, and they carry them inside, but they don't have a language to express. So it just stays within, unexpressed. The past is there, in their chest, it sits there. And then the second generation is usually not that interested in the past because they're busy doing other things. They have to find their feet. It has to be a tabula rasa. You have to be forward looking and just adopt and just blend in. So they're not that eager to talk about the past. And therefore it is the third or the fourth generations in these families, the youngest in these families, who are asking the strongest and the sharpest questions about identity, about their ancestors' journeys. And what moves me is to see young people carrying the memories of their grandparents. So you can come across young people in immigrant families who have old memories. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in inherited pain. And one more thing, of course, this book always connects nature with, you know, human beings. I think this ecosystem is very important. There has been a remarkable body of scientific research in the last, especially in the last decades, that show trees that have experienced some kind of trauma respond differently to next traumas. Not only that, but trees that descend from trees that have, you know, experienced some kind of, you know, wildfire or drought and etc. So those that have descended from these trees also have somehow the memory of trauma. So we understand that this is already happening in nature, but we are not that ready to accept that it's also happening amongst us human beings. We talk about how we have inherited the shape of our cheeks or chin or the color of our hair, or whether we sneeze in the sun or not from our grandparents, but we're not, you know, that ready to talk about inherited pain. But I think it is a reality.
In the connection you talk about there between humans and trees, that is very telling, because in one place you're here talking about family trees. And if I may read it, you say, if families resemble trees, as they say, family traumas are like thick, translucent resin dripping from a cut in the bark. They trickle down generations. And that analogy is, of course, very fitting, very appropriate, given, as you mentioned earlier, fig tree being the protagonist in your novel. So let's talk a little bit about the tree. First of all, I really would love to hear how you decided to write from the perspective of a tree. How did that idea come to you? And then why a fig tree? And last but not least, it's a female tree. So why a female tree?
I mean, I'm, you know, I'm a tree hugger. You know, I love trees. I love reading about trees, thinking about trees. But of course, like many people, I think in my case as well, the pandemic pushed me further in that direction, even though I started writing this before. But, you know, understanding and the ecological crisis, you know, it's just the urgency of this moment. We're all shaped by this moment we're in, for sure. But if I may take you back in time a little bit, I used to live in the States. I lived in America for about 5 years, and I was in completely different parts of the States. I was a visiting scholar, and I wrote almost three of my novels in the States. And when I was in Michigan, the winters were very cold, and I met some Italian-American families who would bury their fig trees if the winters were particularly harsh. And I remember that. To me, that is such an important metaphor. If you're going to write about an island as beautiful, but as complex as Cyprus, that metaphor of burial and unburial is going to be important. So this is a botanical technique that many immigrant families from all over the Mediterranean are aware of, especially the first generation. And basically what they do is they prune their trees, and these vertical trees, they become horizontal because they're pushed into the ground. You know, you dig a trench, you gently push the tree there, you cover it with soil, and the tree remains under the ground for the following weeks, sometimes month, until spring comes and the weather is warmer, and then you unbury them. In Cyprus, as you know, there's a committee, there's a bicommunal organization, and I have so much respect for these people. It's called the Committee on Missing Persons. It was launched by United Nations, but it's the islanders, it's the Cypriots who are doing the real work, and Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots are working together. And many of them are women, many of them are young and volunteers. They come from all backgrounds. There are forensic specialists among them, there are university students among them, right? And basically they're digging the ground in order to find the bones of the people who have gone missing during the worst time of ethnic violence on the island. So they're digging the ground, they're finding the bones, they're sending the bones to the lab. And why they're doing this? Not in order to revive old animosities or hatreds. They're doing it because they want to give the dead dignity, a proper burial, funeral, and the families a sense of closure and the possibility for healing. So this to me is very, very moving. And of course, it is an issue that's not only relevant for Cyprus, but all across South America, in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, in Spain after the civil war, in Bosnia after the genocide, and Iraq more recently. There have been people digging the ground looking for the bones of their ancestors. And so the tree allowed me to jump, into difficult issues, but also it gave me a chance to think more carefully about what does it mean to be rooted, uprooted, almost deracinated, rootless. So I think I really owe the tree. If this is a multi-layered story, I think the fig tree allowed me to do this. And it is a female tree, and it is an immigrant tree, because yeah, that's how the story came to me. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, just as you are talking about all this shows, those throughout the novel, there are so many powerful images and metaphors of roots, of course, being rooted, uprooted, just like you were saying, or burials, burying, unburying. And they have layers and layers of meaning in terms of immigration, in terms of violence. And you also mentioned this. I feel like in this book, you are in some ways unburying that tree, the tree being the story of Cyprus, which is buried, at least for those of us who don't live there, buried, but very much alive, breathing underground. And you have unburied it and propped it up so that it can breathe in the fresh air in some ways, and also so that we can take notice, so that we can witness its truth. So thank you so much for that. I was very interested in the Committee of Missing Persons. Their work I did not know about. I was deeply moved about that. And it is heart-rending, very difficult yet necessary task. And somewhere in the novel, I hope I'm quoting this correctly, you say something about this is not about power or politics, but memories and grief.
Yeah.
And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah.
To go back to this beautiful tree, she has such a distinct voice. There's wisdom and there is such intimacy. She's intelligent, perceptive, intuitive, and humorous. And in particular, I enjoyed her observations about human beings, about us. One of those, an example would be when she talks about our human perception of time being linear, yesterday, today, tomorrow, whereas a tree's perception of time being cyclical, circular, the past always being breathing in the present. Can you tell us a little bit more about that concept of time circular and its importance for memory, for remembering?
It is so important. I mean, how we perceive time. Imagine Cyprus is such a beautiful island that is visited by so many, let's say, European travelers, right? Where I am right now, right? The UK. It's one of the top destinations for British tourists. People go there, and yet there's very little knowledge about the complexity of its history, even though it's also part of British history, right? The history of Cyprus. So what I'm trying to say is we human beings tend to forget very easily. And I say this as a writer who comes from Turkey, and Turkey, as you know, of course, has a very long and rich history, but that doesn't translate into strong memory. I think in Turkey in particular, we're a society of collective amnesia. The easiest thing is to forget. Our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures, the void. And that void has to be filled in by something. And usually that something is either an ultra-nationalist or an Islamist interpretation of the past that says, we were always a mighty empire, we were always great. Yes, but the past changes, depending on who is telling the story. So we have the right to ask, what about untold stories? What about those stories that have been silenced, that erased, forgotten, pushed to the periphery? To me, this is very important. So to try to understand where are the untold stories. And the second thing is we humans tend to think that time is linear, that it has to be progressive, that it has to proceed in one direction only, that tomorrow has to be better than tomorrow, than yesterday, more developed, more advanced, but not necessarily. In fact, I think countries can sometimes slide backwards, and generations can make the mistakes, not maybe exactly the same, but similar mistakes that their great-grandparents had already made. So we have to learn, we have to understand the complexity of the past. Now, from a tree's perspective, there's no such thing as a linear history. Time is cyclical, it is perennial, and I think tree time or arborescent time is much closer to story time, because you don't tell a story in a linear way. In stories as well, there are all these little connections and then little maybe circles. You come back, you understand the past. So you move in multiple directions at the same time. That's why I think a tree can understand story time better than our minds that have been conditioned in this linear understanding of time, which is actually an illusion.
Yeah, and somewhere in your novel, you do talk about a tree being a memory keeper, right? Just like stories. And you already said here that memory is a responsibility. So thank you for all those thoughts. As everyone can see, some of us have read the novel. It's a new novel, so perhaps some people haven't read it yet, but it's very clear, very apparent that this novel has so many dimensions to it, ecological, historical, of course, political, psychological. And let's not forget that it is also a love story. Can you tell us a little bit about Kostas and Daphne?
I really appreciate your saying this. It is a love story, and you might say it's a forbidden love. At first glance, of course, they come from opposite tribes. So Kostas is Greek Cypriot. He's raised in a Christian family, and Daphne is Turkish Cypriot, and she's raised in a Muslim family. But the thing is, for me, they are such different personalities. Kostas is such a gentle soul, and of course he cares about human suffering, but he equally cares about the suffering of animals and plants and trees. So he sees everything as connected, which is a very difficult thing to talk about when there's ethnic violence or war going on. If you talk about the suffering of plants, people will think it's an insult. So he keeps all that sensitivity within. Daphne, on the other hand, she also cares deeply about suffering, but for her, human suffering is the primary thing, And there's another, in another sense, there's a duality between them, because one of them leaves the island, the other one stays. And this is something that I think about a lot, those who leave and those who stay. I think those who stay, of course, they deal with the wounds, they deal with the scars, and it's incredibly painful. But perhaps they have to, in order to survive, it's more straightforward. They know what they have to deal with. Whereas those who leave, and this is something that perhaps concerns us, all immigrants, exiles, whatever you call us, you carry something within you and you can't quite voice it. You never get a chance to heal, Maybe it doesn't look as brutal as for those who have stayed, but it's much more long lasting. So there is that duality as well between those who leave and those who stay. So for me, it wasn't just, they're coming from opposite tribes. They're really different personalities, and yet they love each other. And that's something that does keep happening, and we should never lose sight of that. Even in moments of horrific divisions and partitions and hatred and animosity, human beings have continued to connect and love each other. There have been stories of friendship. There have been stories of sisterhood and stories of love. So I am interested in those things that travel beyond borders. Love, definitely, but also superstitions, food, migratory birds. How come, even when the walls are high, with barbed wire, these things continue to travel? And I think we shouldn't forget that.
Thank you for saying that and expressing it so beautifully. And it's true. Kostas and Daphne's is a forbidden love story, as you said, but it's also a very daring love story and enduring. And it's really important to remember the endurance of that and how it brings a new level of dignity in some ways to the story. And it is not just Cypriot Turks and Greeks, of course. We see these forbidden love stories everywhere, every day, around the world, different cultures, different races, different religions, gender. And in the end, such a simple message: love is love. And so this is a wonderful reminder of that. Thank you. Since you mentioned food just now, I do want to go back to it, because food is very central to all your novels. I really love that. And in this one especially, there's this 2-page menu of a tavern. And may I say, such a delightful, delectable, exquisite menu. And as a Turkish immigrant, of course, it's filled my heart with such yearning and longing. There is Meryem in the story. Meryem is Daphne's sister who lives in Cyprus and then comes to London to visit. And of course, the minute she arrives, she goes into the kitchen and starts cooking up feast after feast. And at one point, she turns to Ada in Turkish, who is Daphne and Kostas's daughter. She turns to Ada and says, "If you do not know your ancestors' cuisine, you do not know who you are." That's a remarkable comment about the relationship between food and identity. If you don't know your ancestors' cuisine, you do not know who you are. So if I may ask you a little bit about that, and also perhaps your relationship to your ancestral food, the cuisine that you write so beautifully about, perhaps some of the tastes and smells that are most evocative to you, that transport you to childhood or wherever they may, and the meaning of all that.
That's such a beautiful question. You know, the Auntie Meryem in this novel, I feel like I know her. I've been raised by women like her. You know, my grandmother was actually very similar to her. And this is a woman who raised me until I was about 10 years old. I was born in France, and then I came to Turkey with my mother when my parents got separated. And my mom, she had to go back to university. So it was basically my grandmother who brought me up until I was 10. And she wasn't a well-educated woman. She had been denied a proper education for being a girl. And she wholeheartedly supported women's education. So it was she who said to my mother, "You need to go back to college, you know, you need to get your diploma," because my mom had married at such a young age, despite, you know, her mom saying, "You finish your college university degree first." So grandma was an important figure in my life. And she was very wise. She had a very different type of wisdom. And I think she connected me to this world of oral culture or oral storytelling. And I've never belittled that world. You know, sometimes, especially in Turkey, people who are in the world of written culture look down upon oral culture, seeing it as the field of ignorance, you know, superstitions, women. I've read so many articles, you know, belittling oral culture. And there's a part of me that rejects that. I would like my work as much as I can, as best as I can, to bridge written culture and oral culture. And the reason I'm mentioning all this is because in grandma's house, there were lots of superstitions. There was magic. She would, you know, melt lead to ward off the evil eye. She would be reading coffee cups. She had her way of telling stories. And food for her was a language. It took me a while to realize that she had experienced lots of hardships herself, and food was how she expressed herself. There are women like my grandmother who want to tell you so many things. They don't know how to say it, so instead they feed you, right? And they have this naive belief that if we can all sit around the same table and break bread together, you know, and share the same water, maybe there will be less misunderstandings in this world. Sometimes I jokingly think in the Middle East, across the Levant, we have these baklava wars, right? The Lebanese think they make the best baklava. The Syrians, they believe their baklava is the best. We Turks are very confident that we make the best baklava. And of course, the Greeks claim it's their baklava. But the beauty of food is it's nobody's baklava. And there's a rebellion to it. You know, it does travel beyond borders, and people have been connecting throughout centuries. So all I'm trying to say is food is always more than food. I think it is a language. And what we remember through those, it's very sensual, like the tastes, the smells of food. Sometimes I think I'm like, okay, I don't think about Turkey as much, I think. And then suddenly the smell of roasted chestnuts, suddenly it hits me so badly, you know, and you feel pain. Where does that come from? Just a little smell, a whiff in the air, in the breeze. So I think smells and flavors, they take us into stories, they take us into emotions, they directly take us into the stories of our childhood and the deepest emotions that we carry within.
Yeah. Thank you, Elif. I mean, it's first of all, thank you for sharing that personal bit, introducing us all to your lovely grandmother. And though it might be naive, I just love her vision of, yes, only if we could all gather around the same table and break bread, if only we could. And it is very sensual. It's the way you write about food, I can almost taste it. And that's why I said to my immigrant heart, like I yearn for it as I'm reading the description, as I'm reading Marianne's cooking here. You also do that with nature. Like when I was reading this novel, I could feel almost the wind in my hair, and I can smell the Mediterranean Sea, and I can almost hear the chirping of the birds and the buzzing of the bees. And like you said, some parts of this novel you did write during the pandemic. And under lockdown. And that makes me wonder what that experience was writing about the lively outside world, nature, while the world is shut down and is in isolation. What was that experience like?
Indeed, I sincerely believe we have arrived at a major crossroads, and we have to wake up. We cannot continue to assume that we're the center of the universe, that we are above all other creatures. It cannot go on like this. So from the perspective of a tree, actually, there's no such thing as an insignificant animal. There are sections in the book when the fig tree actually makes fun of the ways in which human beings have a hierarchy in their minds. We think animals with, big eyes are very cute, but animals that don't have big eyes are not that close to our hearts. Where does that come from? Again, human beings, we tend to belittle, for instance, fruit bats. But from the perspective of a tree, a fruit bat is so precious. That's how they pollinate. It's the fruit bats that carry all those seeds miles and miles away. So if we enjoy fruits, if we enjoy the shade of a tree, actually we owe it to these fruit bats and insects and birds that carry the seeds everywhere. My point is they're all interconnected, just being aware of that ecosystem. And in the middle of a pandemic, of course, you understand that this in a more urgent way when we can't go out, being aware of these connections. And it really breaks my heart that at a moment when we need global solidarity and global sisterhood the most, where we've ended up is vaccine nationalism. At a moment when we need more international connections and conversations and urgent change, we're seeing a rise in tribalism. To assume that by erecting walls or making it more difficult to travel into that country or this country, to think that you're going to keep other people's problems at bay is an illusion. Didn't we see that a virus originating in one part of the world affected the lives and livelihoods of people miles and continents away? We have massive global challenges ahead of us, and we're all interconnected. So it's that crossroads that I think makes us realize things can't go on like this. And in that regard, I honestly think we have a lot to learn from trees. If we could only see things the way a tree sees, if we could only appreciate these connections and the ecosystem of which we're only a small part.
I really resonate with what you just said about, I had this hope with the pandemic that we would better understand our interconnectivity as a world, people, nature, everything. And it hasn't been, very painful, it hasn't been the case. It's very contradictory in so many ways. Why do you think that is? I mean, there's so much information at our fingertips, yet is it too much information coming from us, from all sides? Is that why we're shutting down, choosing to be numb? Or is it, what are we this afraid of facing a bleak, dark future as much as we're afraid of looking at our dark pasts, histories, violent legacies? What do you think? What's happening?
Yeah, I think everything you said is so powerful. I believe we're living in an age in which we have way too much information, but very little knowledge and even less wisdom. The truth is, we cannot process this much information, and we do not. So just scrolling up and down on our social media feed, and you realize, well, something happened in Afghanistan, something happened in this part of the world, they're just snippets of information, which doesn't really stay with us. We're not processing it. Whether it's 5,000 refugees, 50,000 refugees, the difference in numbers, we can't process that. So we are focusing too much on information. And I think for a long time, we over-romanticized information, thinking that if you spread information, people are going to become informed citizens and they're going to make the right political choices. Whereas in fact, we need to focus on knowledge and ultimately, hopefully, on wisdom. They're completely separate things, The information is fast consumption. We just consume it and leave it behind without really touching our heart. Whereas knowledge requires us to slow down. You can't rush knowledge. For knowledge, we need books. And this is why, these conversations are so precious. We need nuanced conversations in which we can hear each other. We need cultural festivals. I think they're amongst our last remaining democratic spaces. We need bookstores. We need libraries. We need investigative journalism, in-depth analysis that requires us to slow down. And then for wisdom, I think we need to bring the mind and the heart together. We need emotional intelligence. We need empathy. So how do we change this ratio? Let's have less information in our lives, but more knowledge and hopefully more wisdom. You mentioned this age we're living in. I think all of us, we're dealing with lots of negative emotions. It's a time of anxiety. It's the age of angst. Some of us, we maybe make it, we hide it better. Some of us are more open about it. That's the only difference. Otherwise, we're all dealing with uncertainty. We're all dealing with fear, depression, bewilderment, confusion, frustration. And we need to have honest and open conversations about mental health. Mental health issues have been, stigmatized. People have been suffering from mental health issues, have been almost ostracized as if they're losers. We need to change this narrative. We're all dealing with lots of negative emotions, which is very understandable and very human. Actually, if at a moment like this, if you're not overwhelmed with anxiety or anger, sometimes maybe you're not following what's happening. When we do follow, of course, we feel these emotions, and that's okay. The main issue is, what do we do with our emotions? Can we turn it into something more constructive, both for ourselves, but also for our communities? I think that's the real challenge. And the second thing is, I think what really scares me is not, any of these seemingly negative emotions, but the lack of all emotions. So if there's numbness, indifference, when we are desensitized, if we stop caring about each other's stories, from an age of angst, we can very quickly move into an age of apathy. Climate change is so big. What can I do? I'm just an individual. Or let's say another pandemic. It might happen, but what can I do? The moment we start saying, what can I do? I'm just an individual. I can't change anything. And then from there slide into apathy. I think that's a very dangerous threshold.
That's so rich. I mean, we can just continue this, of course, for hours and hours in this conversation. I just want to highlight the importance of what you were saying just now. I was trying to scribble notes here, information versus wisdom, apathy versus empathy, which there is this very short section that I would love to read here, if that's okay, and ask a follow-up question. And this is coming from Daphne in the novel. And she says, there are moments in life when everyone has to become a warrior of some kind. If you're a poet, you fight with your words. If you're an artist, you fight with your paintings. But you can't say, sorry, I'm a poet, I'll pass. You don't say that when there's so much suffering, inequality, injustice. And you already talked a little bit about this with bookstores, books, but can you tell us a little bit more about the role, responsibility of artists, of poets and novelists, storytellers in the face of all the crises we face, whether it's ecological, environmental destruction, or racism, xenophobia, economic inequality? Of course, we don't have a shortage of injustices, inequalities in the world today.
Yeah, I think for many of us who are coming from non-Western parts of the world, coming from wounded democracies as writers, we don't have the luxury of being apolitical. You can't say, I don't want to talk about politics. I only want to talk about my own stories, my own fiction, when so much is happening outside the window. Also, I am a feminist, and I've learned many wonderful things from past feminists, generations of feminist theory and practice. And of course, one of the main things that I've learned personally is that politics is not only what Boris Johnson said today or what happened in the British Parliament yesterday. It's more than that. Wherever there's power inequality, there's politics. So the personal is also political. You might be talking about sexuality, you might be questioning gender discrimination, that too is political. So in that regard, inside a novel, there is politics. Writers cannot be apolitical. And I think what I'm talking about, many authors across the Western world who are coming from minority communities or minority backgrounds, they're so aware of this. And many of them, like in America, unfortunately, we've seen this horrible rise, this anti-Asian, hatred, racism in America being on the rise. And many writers and poets from similar communities I've been following it, have been so, rightly so, very vocal in their criticism. They have directly participated in the public space. And I admire that, I respect that. So we cannot be silent on core issues, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. We need to speak up. I'm not talking about party politics, and I'm definitely not talking about partisan politics. I don't like that. But to be, aware of these core elements that sustain a democracy. That said, I'm also aware that writers should not write with, a mission in mind. I don't like that. I find that off-putting. But I believe our jobs, my job as a right novelist is to ask questions, including difficult questions about difficult issues, then create an open space where a variety of opinions can be heard, but ultimately leave the answers to the reader. Because every reader is going to come up with their own answers, with their own interpretation, Our readings are unique, like our fingerprints. So it's just chasing the silences and being aware of the importance of questions and opening up debates and being aware of the importance of pluralism, diversity. These are the issues that I deeply care about in my novels.
If that really comes across, one of the things I most appreciate about your approach is what you just said. There's no lesson to be learned, but you pose these questions, these difficult ideas, and I see you wrestling with them on the page, and there's almost an invitation to the reader, come along, wrestle with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I so appreciate that. I find that essential and at times overlooked. So thank you for doing that. And also thank you, because just like Daphne said in the novel, there are moments in life when everyone has to become a warrior of one kind. You are such a warrior. You do always stand up and speak out about the injustices and inequalities. You are, in each and every novel, you amplify the voices of the marginalized communities, you shed light on the obscure, you lend an ear to the silenced histories, the untold stories, and you take on complexity. You dance with it almost, you feel you have a comfortable, inviting way with complexity. And in that sense, you demonstrate to us how literature or arts and social responsibility can go hand in hand seamlessly. Critical thinking and imagination can come hand in hand. And so thank you for your courage doing that, because it does take a lot of courage. And thank you for your commitment. And with that, I would like to, Peter has so kindly offered to help us with the Q&A. So Peter, if you are ready, can you share
Indeed.
us the
And we have quite
questions?
a few questions. So we'll see. Let's see if I can call through some of this. Adrita has a two-part question. In regards to books containing graphic scenes, with the rise of mental health awareness and the implementation of trigger warnings, do you think books should have reader discretion or trigger warnings? And then second part, about creating characters for your novel. Do your characters have any relation to you or the people around you?
Beautiful questions, tough questions as well. With regards to having trigger warnings, I really think it also depends on how you say what you're saying. For me, as Ipek so generously, so eloquently, mentioned, for me, it's important to try to, at least in my own way, to try to give more voice to people whose voices we don't usually hear in this dominant narrative, people who've been pushed to the periphery, dehumanized. And many things that they experience today and in the past are actually quite dark stories, difficult subjects, including sexual discrimination, sexual harassment. There are many difficult subjects to write about, but I think we need to be able to write about this. It just is an issue of whose perspective you're trying to bring to the center. I personally want to bring the periphery to the center. I want to, as best as I can, rehumanize people who have been dehumanized or just turned into numbers or just turned into sweeping generalizations. So I don't like it when we draw limits to literature and think that, okay, you can't go in that direction because that's a difficult subject. If that's how you feel as a storyteller, I think we constantly need to take on these, including difficult subjects, but it's a matter of how you write. Compassion is important, I think, in addition to critical thinking. Also, this might sound maybe odd, but I love the dance of humor and melancholy. Maybe it's because I lived in Istanbul for so long, and Istanbul is a city that constantly mixes everything. It doesn't put them into neat boxes. Even in sometimes the saddest moment, there's an element of absurd or surreal, or sometimes in the funniest moments, there's something really sad. So it mixes, and life mixes these things. So it all depends on how you write. With regards to the characters, are they related to me? I have a lot of respect for people who write in a more autobiographical way. And I understand when critics say that at the end of the day, novelists project their own thoughts, emotions, or their own lives into their stories. However, I do not see literature as necessarily autobiographical. What is much more interesting for me is to make it transcendental. I want to transcend the borders of the self that has been given to me by birth. I'm much more interested in becoming other people and trying to look at the world through their perspective, through their stories. So of course there are emotional connections, but my work is not autobiographical in that sense.
I have a question from Hussein, who says, in your books, you focus a lot on trauma, identity, and most importantly, the broken and the underdogs. To what degree do you believe generational trauma is resolvable for non-conforming individuals in conservative Middle Eastern families? don't you think their truth would be jeopardized in their attempt in healing deep family traumas?
It's a wonderful question. And again, it's a difficult one, but I think when we don't speak about these traumas, they don't go away. They don't just disappear. They still continue to exist via the silences, via those untold stories. And we can never heal if we can't remember. In order to repair, we have to remember. So I find it healthier to be, if we can open up conversations, if we can create spaces where people who do carry these traumas find an opportunity, to speak without being judged, find a space, a safe space in which their sorrows, their stories are respected, I think that's healthier. And so in that regard, families do have to have these difficult conversations. And I have a lot of respect for young people, as we mentioned earlier, because of these intergenerational differences, especially younger generations who are daring to ask these questions about identity and their ancestors' journeys. The only thing I want to add is that's where we start. That shouldn't be where we end up. From those stories, we want to go forward, move forward. But in order to be able to move forward, we have to remember first. And I really think in that sense, memory is a responsibility and is a necessity.
And then Nevroz asks, let's see. Just like you, I'm a believer in sisterhood. I work in an all-girls academy and wanted to ask, what do you think is the best way to champion the importance of sisterhood in education and in everyday living?
It's beautiful. I think it means nothing. It means nothing if we have, let's say, a few successful, quote unquote, women in business world, a few successful women in media, a few here, like tokens. It means nothing if we cannot empower each other. If we don't build these connections and help each other, especially when we arrive at difficult moments in our lives. The digital spaces are becoming increasingly difficult for women. Every study shows, especially there was a United Nations report recently that showed throughout the pandemic, the abuse that women and minorities receive on social media platforms has escalated in country after country. We need to create better digital spaces as well as public spaces in which women and minorities can voice their opinions, that they're not pushed to the margins, and we can only do this together. So to me, it's very important to be aware of the necessity of sisterhood, solidarity, and we can only do this if we reach out beyond borders. If we stay in our own little tribes, in our own little cocoons, I think we will all lose. When we are divided, the only thing that benefits from it is patriarchy itself.
So Narges asks, going down a different road here, what is the best advice you would give for younger writers today about writing novels and the craft of storytelling?
That's a wonderful question. I think writers need to be, it's so obvious, but it's worth mentioning. We need to be two things all our lives. We need to be readers, primarily good readers, but also good listeners. Just trying to listen to what people are saying, how they're saying, and be open to learning from everyone, from anyone, to learn across disciplines. I love interdisciplinary conversations. I don't think we should be reading only one type of, books, but to read both fiction and nonfiction, to be open to learn from disciplines we might not know anything about. That's when the mind is really triggered or it just learns faster. But primarily, I think being a writer, in order to be a writer, we need an inner garden because so much of it happens here. This is a solitary task. You are on your own for weeks and for months. We're not exactly doing teamwork. Of course, we do when it's published, and there's a lot of effort that goes into it with editors and designers, and I respect that a lot. But for a long time, you are on your own. So we have to nurture this inner garden. And I very quickly want to add this. In Turkey, I used to go to schools to give talks. This is something I observed both in Turkey and across the Middle East. If you speak to a 6-year-old, 7-year-old Egyptian or Turkish or Jordanian child, they're not different at all from a French or Canadian or American child of that age. They all have so much chutzpah, so much confidence, creativity, right? And if you ask in a room full of children, is there anyone here who would like to become a writer someday? So many hands go up. Anyone who would like to become a poet someday or artist, hands go up. But then I would go and speak to students who are attending high school or middle school, you know, after puberty, and everything has changed. Now girls don't want to talk. They've become timid because we taught them as a society not to speak up, you know, to be careful that other people will judge you. Now in a room full of 15-year-old, 16-year-old kids in Turkey, if you ask, is there anyone here who would like to become a writer? Who is a writer? Nobody puts their hand up. Because we have told them to leave that creativity inside, bury it inside. So in order to be able to write, I think we need to go back to our 6-year-old, 7-year-old confidence and nurture our inner garden, and don't let anyone pull you down.
I think that is a beautiful place to end our discussion today. This has been really very, very rich and very, very deep talk. Really ever grateful to you both for this. Thank you, Elif Shafak. Thank you, Ipek, for being such an excellent interviewer.
Thank you.
You know, and a big shout out to Rosie at Bloomsbury for all of her efforts in making today a reality. And of course, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us and completing the circle. And hope everyone stays safe, stays well. We look forward to seeing you all again soon.